What do you think you're doing?
Excuse me, what's the problem?
Don't play dumb with me. You must think security's a joke showing up in a fake uniform acting like you're a pilot.
Fake?
I'm not just...
The officer's voice reached him before the words did. It carried across the terminal with the particular sharpness of someone who had already made up their mind. Not a question, not a procedural stop, but a confrontation that had formed in the officer's head before his feet had finished moving. He planted himself directly in Captain Khalil Davis's path and looked at the uniform, looked at the stripes, looked at the man wearing them. And what passed across his face in that moment had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with the conclusion he had already reached. Khalil stopped, flight bag over one shoulder, captain's wings pinned precisely above his left breast pocket. 15 years of aviation behind him and a flight departing in under 2 hours ahead of him. He had returned from a 2-week vacation that morning, rested and prepared, moving through the terminal the same way he always moved, with the measured, unhurried confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going and exactly what he was doing. The officer saw a black man in a captain's uniform he did not recognize, and that, in the calculation his mind ran in the space of 3 seconds, was enough. What Security Officer Daniel Reeves did not know, what he was about to discover when his supervisor arrived less than 6 minutes later, was that the man he had just stopped was not only a legitimate captain with 15 years and thousands of flight hours to his name, but that every word he was about to say, every assumption he was about to act on, and every racially charged remark he was about to make was being recorded in full by the body camera clipped to his own chest. The camera he had forgotten was running. The camera that would end his career, validate Khalil's lawsuit, and produce a settlement that would force an entire airport authority to restructure how it hired, trained, and supervised its security personnel. But before any of that, before the investigation, before the footage review, before the legal team and the federal filing and the national coverage, there was a captain standing in a terminal in full uniform with handcuffs on his wrists. Before we go further, drop your city or country in the comments right now. We want to know where you're watching from. And if you believe a decorated pilot should be able to walk through an airport in his own uniform without being treated like a suspect, hit like and subscribe. This story is one you need to hear all the way through. Atlanta International Airport on a Wednesday morning in early October moved the way large airports always move, with the kind of organized volume that looks like chaos from the outside and functions like clockwork from within. The departures board cycled through gate assignments. The security lines processed thousands of passengers in steady rotation. Ground crews moved across the tarmac in the gray pre-dawn light, and inside the terminal the air carried the particular blend of coffee, jet fuel filtered through climate control, and the low constant hum of a facility that never fully stops. Captain Khalil Davis entered through the main terminal doors at 6:47 in the morning and moved toward the crew corridor with the unhurried precision of a man who had made this walk hundreds of times. He was 40 years old, and the 15 years he had spent in commercial aviation had shaped not just his career but his bearing, the way he carried his flight bag, the way his eyes moved across a space without appearing to scan it, the way his uniform sat on him like something he had earned rather than simply put on. Because he had earned it. Every element of what he wore had been accumulated through years of early mornings and late departures, through instrument certifications and command evaluations, through the kind of sustained professional discipline that transformed competence into mastery. The uniform itself was immaculate. The navy jacket bore 4 gold stripes on each sleeve, the designation of captain rank within Meridian Airways, one of the busiest carriers operating out of Atlanta. His wings were centered and level above the left breast pocket. His name tag, Captain K. Davis, was positioned on the right side with the same precision he applied to everything that carried his name. His white shirt was pressed. His black slacks held their crease. Nothing about his appearance was casual because nothing about 15 years in the cockpit had been casual. He had been away for 2 weeks. The vacation had been the first extended leave he had taken in 14 months, and he had used it deliberately visiting family in Houston, sleeping without an alarm, allowing his mind to decompress from the accumulated weight of schedules and weather systems and pre-flight checklists that defined the operational rhythm of his working life. He had returned that morning feeling restored. His first flight back, a morning departure to Chicago, was scheduled to push back in 110 minutes. He had time to check in at the crew desk, complete his pre-flight documentation, and review the weather package before boarding began. He was 40 feet from the crew corridor entrance when Officer Daniel Reeves stepped away from the wall and moved directly into his path. Reeves was 27 years old and had been employed as an airport security officer for exactly 14 days. He had been hired as part of an expansion of the terminal security staffing, had completed the standard orientation, and had spent his first 2 weeks shadowing senior officers, learning patrol routes, and building what he believed to be a working knowledge of the airport's personnel. He had seen pilots moving through the terminal during those 14 days. He had noted their uniforms, their bags, their routes. He had begun to develop a mental catalog of faces: the gate agents who worked the early shift, the maintenance crew members who serviced the jet bridges, the flight crews who passed through in formation toward their gates. He had never seen Khalil Davis before, because Khalil Davis had been on vacation for the entirety of Reeves' employment. But Reeves did not account for that. His catalog felt complete to him, with the particular false confidence of someone who does not yet understand the scale of what they do not know. What Reeves saw when Khalil approached was a black man in a captain's uniform he did not recognize. The conclusion that formed required no evidence to support it. It arrived fully assembled, rooted not in procedure but in a set of assumptions that had been operating beneath the surface of every interaction Reeves had logged since his third day on the job. He stepped into Khalil's path and stopped. The posture was not procedural. It was confrontational, body angled forward, jaw set, the posture of someone who had already decided the outcome of the exchange before it began. Khalil stopped mid-stride, his expression shifting from neutral to measured attention. He looked at the officer. He noted the newness of the uniform, the fabric unworn, the badge without the dulling that comes from months of handling, the overall appearance of someone still in the early weeks of their first posting. He understood within seconds what he was looking at. Reeves spoke loud enough that the passengers within 15 feet of them could hear every word. He told Khalil he didn't recognize him. He said he knew every pilot and crew member operating out of this terminal. He said the uniform looked wrong and the stripes looked wrong, and that he was going to need Khalil to explain himself before he went another step further. The travelers nearest to them slowed. A woman pulling a rolling bag stopped completely and looked over. A man near the newsstand turned. The attention was not yet concentrated, but it was gathering. Khalil's response was composed and direct. He was a captain with Meridian Airways, he explained, returning from 2 weeks of approved leave. Leave that would have begun on the same day Reeves started working the terminal. The unfamiliarity was not suspicious. It was arithmetic. He had not been here. Now he was. Reeves dismissed it without pause. He said the explanation was convenient. He said 2 weeks of employment was more than enough time to know who was legitimate and who was not. His voice carried the particular edge of someone whose certainty is not grounded in knowledge but in the refusal to be corrected. And it was getting louder. Somewhere in the exchange, in the space between Khalil's calm insistence and Reeves' escalating dismissal, a remark surfaced that was not procedural, not professional, and not quiet enough to be private. It was directed at the idea of the uniform itself, at the rank it represented, at the person wearing it. It was the kind of remark that does not require interpretation. Several passengers within range heard it clearly. The body camera on Reeves' chest recorded it at full volume. Khalil's jaw tightened. He reached into his flight bag. He produced his federal pilot's license first, the FAA-issued document bearing his photograph, his certification level, his medical clearance, and his expiration date, all current, all legitimate, all exactly what they appeared to be. He produced his Meridian Airways employee identification card second, which listed his name, his employee number, his designation as captain, and the photograph that matched the face of the man holding it. He placed both in Reeves' hand without speaking. Reeves examined them the way a person examines something they have already decided is false, looking not for confirmation but for the flaw that would justify the conclusion already reached. He turned the license over. He held the ID card at an angle. He looked at the photograph, then at Khalil, then back at the photograph. And when he looked up, the expression on his face had not changed. He said the documents were fabricated. He said they were well made but fabricated. He said he would be holding them as material evidence. The terminal had shifted around them. The slow drift of passenger movement had stalled within a 30-foot radius. People were watching. Phones had come out, carefully, quietly at first, held low and angled, and then with less pretense as the exchange continued to escalate. The ambient noise of the terminal, the announcements, the rolling luggage, the gateside conversations, had not diminished, but within the immediate space around Khalil and Reeves it had receded into background, the way sound recedes when something in the foreground demands full attention. Khalil's voice remained controlled. He was firm in the way that people are firm when they have been through difficult moments before and have learned that volume is not the same as authority. He stated clearly that he would not be standing there to receive accusations without evidence. He stated that his credentials were valid and that any verification system the airport operated would confirm that within 60 seconds. He stated that there was a flight he needed to prepare and that this encounter needed to resolve itself immediately. Reeves reached for his belt. The handcuffs appeared in his hand with the practiced motion of someone who had been waiting for a reason to use them, and the declaration that followed, arrest for impersonation, arrest for fraudulent credentials, the formal language of a charge that had no factual basis, landed in the terminal with the kind of institutional weight that freezes people in place even when they know something is wrong. Khalil did not move toward Reeves. He did not raise his hands. He held himself still with the particular stillness of someone managing the full force of their composure in real time. Reeves grabbed his arm. The movement was abrupt and practiced. Grip, turn, pressure applied to redirect, and Khalil was spun to face away from the officer before the full weight of what was happening had settled. His flight bag dropped from his shoulder and fell to the terminal floor. His arms were pulled behind his back. The handcuffs closed around his wrists with the metallic precision of a sound that carried further than it should have in the open space of the terminal, and the passengers who had been watching from a distance and those who had simply been passing through now stood fully still. The officer keyed his radio. His voice carried a tone that did not belong to the situation he was describing, a tone of accomplishment, of a problem identified and contained, of procedure followed to its correct conclusion. He reported a suspect in custody near the crew corridor. He reported the uniform as fraudulent. He reported the identification as counterfeit. He requested supervisor response. Captain Khalil Davis stood in the middle of Atlanta International Airport in his captain's uniform with his hands restrained behind his back, and the silence around him was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of a crowd that had watched something happen and had not yet found its voice. The whispers began at the edges. They moved inward. Questions formed between strangers who had been standing close enough to hear. The doubt in those questions was not directed at the man in the handcuffs. Reeves stood beside him with his radio in his hand and his posture unchanged, unaware that the body camera on his chest had recorded every word he had said from the moment he left the wall, including the ones he had not intended for anyone else to hear. The radio crackled. A supervisor was en route. Something much larger than Daniel Reeves understood was already in motion. The footsteps that cut through the terminal carried a different weight than Reeves. They were measured rather than urgent, purposeful rather than reactive. The footsteps of someone who had been moving through airport terminals for 2 decades and understood, from the radio call alone, that what awaited him at the crew corridor entrance was not a routine stop. Chief Security Officer Darius Mitchell was 53 years old, and the 22 years he had spent in aviation security had given him the particular ability to read a scene before he reached it. He read this one from 30 feet away. He saw the crowd first, then the officer, then the man in handcuffs. Then he saw the face of the man in handcuffs, and everything else in his field of vision became secondary. Mitchell had worked at Atlanta International for 11 years. In that time he had overseen security operations across 4 terminals, had managed staffing through 2 major expansions, and had developed professional relationships with most of the senior flight crew members who operated out of the facility on a regular basis. Captain Khalil Davis was not a peripheral figure in that network. He was one of the most recognizable captains in Meridian Airways' Atlanta operation, known to the crew desk staff by name, known to the gate supervisors by sight, known to Mitchell personally from the kind of repeated professional proximity that accumulates over years of working the same facility on overlapping schedules. What crossed Mitchell's face as he closed the remaining distance was not a gradual realization. It was immediate and total, the expression of a man absorbing two pieces of information simultaneously, who was standing in handcuffs, and what that meant for every decision that had been made in the past 8 minutes. He did not address Khalil first. He addressed Reeves. The question he put to the officer was not loud in the way that anger is sometimes loud. It was precise, delivered at a volume that reached the crowd without performing for it, and it contained within its structure the full weight of institutional authority redirected from the wrong target to the right one. He wanted to know, specifically and immediately, on what basis a senior captain with 15 years of verified service had been placed in restraints in the middle of a public terminal without verification, without supervisor consultation, and without a single procedural step that Mitchell could identify as having been followed correctly. Reeves opened his mouth. The words that emerged were defensive in structure and unconvincing in delivery, the attempt of someone trying to reconstruct a justification for a conclusion that had never had one. He had not recognized the captain. He had not seen the credentials as legitimate. He had believed the situation required immediate action. Mitchell's response was the instruction to remove the handcuffs. The order was not repeated. It did not need to be. The metal disengaged from Khalil's wrists and he brought his arms forward with the deliberate steadiness of someone who had decided, somewhere in the previous 8 minutes, that the way he carried himself through the remainder of this encounter would matter as much as anything that had been said. He rubbed his wrists once. A brief, functional gesture, and then he stood straight, flight bag retrieved from the floor at his feet, and he said nothing. His silence in that moment was not passive. It was the silence of a man who understood that the situation was already documenting itself, and that composure was the most powerful thing he could contribute to the record being assembled around him. The crowd that had gathered did not disperse when the handcuffs came off. It shifted. The uncertain murmuring that had characterized the previous several minutes, the half-formed questions between strangers, the hesitant discomfort of people witnessing something that felt wrong but carried the intimidating veneer of official action, had resolved into something more direct. The phones that had been recording at careful angles were no longer careful. The voices that had been held low enough to be deniable were no longer low. What the crowd had watched happen, and what it was now watching be corrected, had clarified the situation in a way that left very little room for interpretation. Mitchell pulled Reeves away from the immediate scene. What passed between them in the next 3 minutes was not a conversation. It was an accounting, methodical, cold, and one-directional, the kind of exchange that occurs when an institution is in the process of separating itself from an error before the error has time to calcify into liability. Mitchell had been a security professional long enough to recognize, in real time, the specific configuration of factors that produces a federal lawsuit: documented racist remarks, a false arrest, a victim with an unblemished professional record, a crowd of witnesses, and multiple recording devices. He had seen one piece of each before. He had never seen all of them assembled simultaneously around a single incident. He had Reeves escorted to the security office and instructed him not to speak to anyone, not to passengers, not to colleagues, and not to anyone outside the facility, until Mitchell returned. Then he went to the monitoring room. The body camera footage loaded in under 4 minutes. Mitchell watched it from the beginning, from the moment Reeves left his post along the wall, through the initial confrontation, through Khalil's measured attempts at explanation, through the credential presentation and dismissal, through the arrest. He watched it twice. The second time he paused it at the moment the racist remark was captured, centered in the audio track at full clarity, and he sat with that still frame long enough to understand completely what he was looking at. He pulled Reeves' personnel file on the same screen. 7 incident reports filed in 14 days of employment, each one involving a person of color. The pattern did not require analysis. It announced itself. A black woman questioned 3 times over a first-class boarding pass. A Latino maintenance worker detained despite a visible, valid employee badge. A black airline employee pulled from her duties at baggage claim and held until her supervisor was called to vouch for her presence. 5 additional incidents following the same architecture: assumption of illegitimacy, demand for verification beyond what the situation required, resolution in which the person stopped had done nothing wrong and the officer had documented nothing actionable. Khalil's arrest was the 7th. It was also the one that involved someone with the standing, the documentation, and the institutional support to ensure the pattern was not quietly filed and forgotten. What neither Reeves nor the watching crowd had known at the time of the arrest, what would not surface publicly until Meridian Airways released a statement 3 days after the incident, was that Captain Khalil Davis had been formally identified 6 weeks prior as a candidate for the airline's chief pilot advancement track. The selection process had been initiated by the airline's director of flight operations following a performance review cycle that placed Khalil among the top 3 candidates across the entire Atlanta hub. The role under consideration would have placed him in oversight of training standards and operational protocols for hundreds of pilots across the eastern region. He was not simply a respected captain. He was, in the airline's own internal assessment, one of the most valuable operational figures in their fleet. The incident had not targeted a random employee. It had targeted the wrong person in every possible configuration of that phrase. Before we go further, think about what you just heard. Was what Reeves did a product of ignorance or intentional bias? Drop your answer in the comments, type ignorance or bias, and tell us why you think so. Mitchell called Reeves into his office that afternoon and terminated his employment before the day's final shift change. The termination letter cited racial discrimination, violation of equal treatment protocols, conduct unbecoming of airport security personnel, and the execution of a false arrest without procedural basis. Reeves was instructed to surrender his badge, radio, and body camera. 2 officers walked him to the exit. He did not return to airport property. The passenger videos reached social media before the 11 o'clock news cycle. By the following morning, 4 separate clips had been aggregated by national outlets, each showing a different angle of the same sequence: the confrontation, the credentials ignored, the arrest, and the reversal. The audio in the clearest recording was sharp enough to capture the remark Reeves had not intended to be heard. Comment sections filled within hours. The story ran nationally by the second day. Meridian Airways issued a public statement expressing full support for Captain Davis and confirming the validity of his credentials, his tenure, and his standing within the organization. Khalil filed the federal lawsuit 4 weeks after the incident. The legal team assembled by his attorneys constructed the case around 4 primary elements: the body camera footage, the 7 incident personnel file, the passenger recordings, and the written record of Khalil's career, 15 years of flight logs, commendations, and performance evaluations that stood in direct, irrefutable contrast to every assumption Reeves had acted on. The airport authority's legal counsel reviewed the evidence package and recommended settlement within 2 months of the filing. A trial, they determined, would produce nothing except a more expensive and more public version of the same outcome. The settlement reached $550,000. The airport authority agreed, as a condition of resolution, to implement mandatory bias awareness training for all incoming security personnel, to establish a credential verification protocol requiring supervisor consultation before any detention involving airline crew members, and to create an independent review board for all incidents flagged as potentially involving racial profiling. Daniel Reeves was 27 years old when his 14-day career ended. The termination notation on his employment record, racial discrimination, false arrest, violation of conduct standards, appeared in every background check that followed. 3 security firms declined his applications within the first year. A 4th conducted a preliminary interview before a hiring manager searched his name and found the passenger footage. He found work eventually, in a logistics warehouse on the eastern edge of the city, far from terminals and uniforms and the authority he had mistaken for certainty. His body camera footage was incorporated into discrimination training curricula at 7 airport authorities within 18 months of the settlement. The clip of his remark, 6 seconds of audio that he had not known was being preserved in the moment he made it, became one of the most widely used examples in bias awareness programming across the aviation security sector. His name, attached permanently to the incident in every article, every legal reference, and every training context that cited the case, became shorthand for a specific and expensive category of institutional failure. Khalil Davis returned to the cockpit 3 days after the incident. He wore the same uniform, the same 4 stripes, the same wings above the left breast pocket, the same name tag positioned on the right side with the same precision it had always been positioned. Nothing about what he wore had changed because nothing about what he wore had ever been the problem. He completed his pre-flight checklist with the methodical attention he brought to every departure, weather reviewed, fuel confirmed, systems verified, crew briefed. When the aircraft pushed back from the gate and the engines came to power and the terminal building receded through the cockpit windows, there was no performance in what he felt. No statement being made. Only the particular clarity that comes to people who have been tested in public and have discovered, through the experience rather than in advance of it, that the thing being tested was never in question. The investigation had not revealed a flaw in his credentials. The footage had not uncovered a gap in his record. The crowd that had watched him stand in handcuffs had not seen guilt. It had seen the distance between assumption and truth made visible in real time, in a public space, in front of cameras that preserved every second of it. What had been deployed against him as diminishment had functioned instead as documentation. What had been intended to reduce his authority had produced, in the legal record and the institutional memory of an entire industry, the most thorough verification of that authority imaginable. The uniform had never been the question. It had never been about the uniform at all. Do you think justice was truly served here? Or do you believe situations like this require deeper consequences to create real change? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's have a real conversation. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, or even made you uncomfortable in a way that opened your eyes, don't just keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone else. Start a conversation. Because awareness is where change begins. Make sure you hit that like button not just for the video, but for the message behind it. And if you want more stories that challenge perspectives, reveal hidden truths, and show how quickly life can change in a single moment, subscribe to the channel, because the next story might hit even closer to home.